Hello. To finish the fight against the heavily misguided categories of Star Wars fans, I'm going to take a look at those who hate the expanded universe. Given I'm the type of guy who bases his opinions off of crucial understandings and research, rather than interpretations and assumptions, I'm 110% convinced that the expanded universe haters are clueless, and they mostly only really started to pop up after the EU was officially decanonized. Everyone who hates the EU, or at the very least says it was never canon, have little to no understanding of the expanded universe. When I discuss the expanded universe haters, I know what the hell I'm talking about. I've made a lot of preparation for the 10 Challenges Trilogy, and maybe after this, I'll make a spin-off like perhaps 5 challenges for Filoni groupies or fanboys. I haven't come up with a final title yet, but I'll put it out on a poll on what you think sounds better. But I'm planning ahead. It's almost like the 10 Challenges series is becoming its own franchise. After this, it'll probably be 5 challenges onwards, but still, here are the 10 challenges for expanded universe haters. Once I complete the trilogy, you will fully understand my basic stance on Star Wars. That being that the sequels suck, prequels rule, and the expanded universe is slandered to all hell. Let's begin. For our first challenge, here's something every expanded universe hater should have done, but were too lazy to do. When EU haters boldly claim a massive chunk of the expanded universe was garbage, everyone who has ever said that has read little to no expanded universe content. Like, the more accessible EU content, like the video games, are a small fraction of the bigger expanded universe. Remember when I debunked Pauper memes? He tried telling me, even though he says the expanded universe was never canon, that he was a fan of it, because he played all those games. And I pointed out to him that given the games are the most accessible, that you aren't exactly an EU fan until you read the books and comics and other licensed stuff. The expanded universe fanbase is a more literary fanbase than anything. That being that true expanded universe fans read the novels and comics. So here's an idea. If you want to boldly claim that the expanded universe was 90% garbage, or 70% garbage, or whatever percent garbage, here's something you should do. Actually read the percentage and experience the stories for yourself. I know it may seem daunting to read all of it, but you're the one who decided to make an absolute statement based on inexperience. And as a wise Jedi Master once said,
"Only a Sith deals in absolutes."
In my 10 challenges for sequel fans video, I put out a challenge and an offer to buy whoever contacts me first, and I'll buy them the Heir to the Empire audiobook to get them started, so they'll see the contrasting quality with the sequel trilogy. Even if you don't like reading, the audiobook option is there. The main EU novels have been re-released as expressive audiobooks presented like a new movie. The only difference being that you need to use your head to visualize everything, which is something EU haters never seem to do. Just like prequel haters, they never seem to do anything critically, like thinking critically. The expanded universe encompasses 30 plus years of lore. The audiobooks are quite long, but just like exercise, the more you'll do it, the more you'll get used to it. Also, on top of that, reading 90% of the expanded universe is a challenge in of itself, because even within the EU fan base, there are a few that have read absolutely every story, and that's because there's different stories published in different regions, so not one country has all the content. Like, Star Wars is an American film franchise, but there's content like perhaps comics released in the UK that are exclusive to that region. But still, it's way quicker to read the expanded universe than Disney Canon. Because looking at the rate Disney pumps shit out, Disney Canon already outnumbers the expanded universe. The audiobook giveaway is still valid to the first sequel fan or expanded universe hater that contacts me, and I will give it away on a whim on Amazon's Audible. But so far, none have taken me up on my challenge. And given it's been 5 to 6 months since I first gave the challenge, it seems no one will take me up on it, which puts a huge grin on my face, because I know I pulled one over them. But hey, if you're an expanded universe hater, then contact me on Discord and ask me if they can have the audiobook. And I'm only getting it for you on the guarantee that you'll listen to the whole thing, beginning to end. That's the penalty for getting something for free. If anyone is brave enough to take me up on my challenge, then I will ask them general questions about the story to prove that they read it. As soon as the audiobook is redeemed, I will tell everyone that a sequel fan or an expanded universe hater took me up on my challenge. Again, the challenge is still open as of this recording, but only to sequel fans or expanded universe haters specifically. I'm not going to give this to anyone who already agrees with me. Sorry, but I need minds to be changed. But since we've got a long road ahead of us, I'm going to get a lot, and I mean a lot, of excuses. And don't worry, I've accounted for all of them, which leads me to my next point. This is a point similar to my context point in my 10 challenges for prequel haters video, with a twist. While prequel haters don't watch the prequels properly, expanded universe haters don't read the EU stories at all, and just like a game of Chinese whispers, get the context of many stories wrong. Here, I'm going to explain the context behind all of the talking points of 10 dumbest things in the EU that a lot of talentless journalists make. First, let's start with the most iconic EU trashing point. Skippy the Force-sensitive droid. Looking at Skippy the droid on Wikipedia, it says at the very top that the story was never legitimate canon in any sense, and it was non-canon satire. This is partly Disney's fault for republishing the story under the Legends label without the previous Infinities label. What's Affinities? Well, basically every single non-canon story, like the what-ifs and the dark side endings of games and that sort of shit that do not line up with the films or anything else in the expanded universe. What basically happened here is that the journalist was so desperate to find non-existent dumb things in the expanded universe that they sourced a satirical stupid story made for fun and tried painting that as an actual expanded universe story, because even the Wikipedia article on Skippy fucking confirms he was never canon. That's the most that's canon about him, is the legend. But the legend never actually happened. It's just a story in universe. Next, let's talk about Dark Empire. This story is not comparable to The Rise of Skywalker upon closer analysis for several main reasons. The one that relates to this video is that people who criticize Dark Empire first of all have never read it. They look at it with the mentality of the prequel trilogy existing. But Dark Empire was a story written before the prequels. You know, before a lot of the established rules were into the ground. George Lucas suggested bringing the Emperor back, but that didn't make him a fucking idiot, given he was still contemplating on making the prequel trilogy. So obviously, Palpatine coming back with the original trilogy being the only George Lucas canon that existed at the time would obviously mean something very, very different. Also, another talking point about Dark Empire is how Luke falls to the dark side, but Luke was actually trying to kill the Emperor. Context. There's more going on than a short summary made by a Disney shill. So what about Mount Sorrow, the crying mountain on Endor? This is one of the dumbest anti-expanded universe arguments, because the source of the damn story was a comic written in the 80s for young children. Leland Chi, keeper of the Holocron, actually explains that the Ewoks' perception of reality is completely skewed by tradition and religion. So just like the Native Americans or Aboriginal Australians, they see the world differently due to their lack of understanding. Mount Sorrow is basically just a fucking legend in Ewok culture. I studied Aboriginal Australian culture in fucking primary school, and the stories they have completely make them view the world differently to those with more perception of the world, given Native Australians were isolated from the rest of the world until Captain Cook showed up, and years later, Arthur Phillip decided to make a colony in what we call today Sydney. Since I'm having fun, let's talk about another misunderstood plot point, that being Chewbacca's death. Of course, Haters who haven't even read the story phrase his canonical death in a way that makes it sound dumb. But if you actually read the story, you would understand that Chewbacca died a hero's death in the saddest way possible. He saved Anakin Solo when he was unconscious, as the planet he was on was about to be destroyed and the moon was going to collide with the planet. Chewbacca had one last heroic roar before meeting his end. When I discuss the context like that, it sounds way cooler than a moon landed on Chewbacca's head. Also, the aftermath of his death was no fucking joke, as Han Solo went into a deep depression, and it took him 5 fucking books to move past it. As you can tell, I'm just gonna keep going. An extremely bizarre, out of context remark that actually exists from idiots who didn't read the story is the claim that Luke fell in love with a computer. This is especially absurd because the story is called the Callista Trilogy, and Luke did not fall in love with the fucking computer. He fell in love with a Jedi called Callista, whose soul was trapped inside the computer. Context. But I'm still not done. Let's talk about all the super weapons built after Return of the Jedi, where again, those stories were written before the prequel trilogy came out, and before the logistics of George Lucas canon were established. But on top of that, the construction of the super weapons are explained. The Sun Crusher gets hated for being overpowered, but it possessed a revolutionary new armor called quantum armor, and it took an alien mind, the researcher Qui Zux, to conceive of the weapon. So it wasn't something they could build easily or instantly. The Death Star took 19 years to build, and the Death Star 2 was built in 4 years during wartime, whereas the first Death Star's construction was kept a secret to the galaxy. Context. So here's the challenge for Expanded Universe haters. Explain to me why the stories are still dumb after I proved you misrepresented them. A lot of the stories I pointed out were written before the prequel trilogy. If you can't explain why they're stupid after I explained all the context, and give the Expanded Universe a real chance, and if you're still persistent, let's move on. For those who try to say the Expanded Universe had no continuity, and it was a jumbled mess, well, first of all, you're dead wrong, and second, you shouldn't be looking at the continuity in the Star Wars franchise in the traditional sense. The thing is, they hierarched content and stacked them up against each other based on validity in the Star Wars canon. Continuity was assembled and judged in an organized tier list. Let's go through the original hierarchy, and don't worry, we'll talk about TCW later down the line, but here was the established tier list until 2008 that so many people sleep on when discussing the EU. At the top we have George Lucas canon. This is the tier that is irrefutably canon in every way, and how appropriate, given Star Wars is first and foremost a film series, which seems to be something Disney doesn't understand, and they rely on Dave Filoni Plus to bail them out of a jam. I'm also going to discuss George Lucas' stance on the Expanded Universe later down the line, so let's continue. Next we've got C Canon, or Continuity Canon, which basically comprise of nearly all mainstream Star Wars content under the George Lucas regime. That includes the comics, games, novels, and stuff released in the mainstream continuity. Next we've got Secondary Canon, or S Canon, which basically includes Star Wars stories that were introduced very early in the franchise's history, such as the original Star Wars Marvel comics, that admittedly had a lot of, shall we say, out there stories. And given the original trilogy wasn't even done yet, it made for a lot of cool stories, but it's considered S-canon because said stories, again, were very out there. Lastly, we have non-canon, stories that never happened in any capacity, like LEGO Star Wars, and satirical stories like Skippy the Droid, which a lot of the moronic journalists desperate to find dumb things in the EU failed to pick up on. That is pathetic, honestly. The comic itself made it clear it wasn't meant to be taken seriously. Maybe they should have read the story, and that was on the full tier list of the Star Wars franchise. Sure, it took years for the continuity hierarchy to be established, but it was established when they absolutely needed to. Given Star Wars got so many fucking books, they needed to categorize them all at some point. These 4 tiers made the expanded universe organized and easy to keep track of. People don't realize that not everything would be followed from, say, S-canon. The stance on that tier has them selectively referencing stuff in higher canon material, mostly C-canon, so in a way it's semi-canon. Some things might be canon and others not. If the expanded universe wasn't organized like this, then I would say yeah, it's messy and jumbled. But given the canon hierarchy exists, it wasn't. The holocron was established in 2000. What's the holocron? Well, basically it's the division of Lucas licensing that kept track of continuity, and given it was a year after The Phantom Menace, it was extremely appropriate timing. Leland Chi, keeper of the holocron, kept continuity in order, telling stories who wrote stories onwards what they could and couldn't do. And given the prequel trilogy was being made, that was extremely important in regards to EU content from the 70s, 80s and 90s. But why wasn't the holocron established earlier? Well, here's the thing. Given George Lucas in the 90s was still trying to decide whether or not to make the prequel trilogy, there wasn't much of a demand to keep all the continuity in check for a trilogy that George didn't know he was going to make. But even before then, the expanded universe did a pretty good job of maintaining its own continuity. One extremely hard-hitting example is the original Marvel comics, ironically. There were a lot of ideas for the comics that Lucasfilm shut down. Lucasfilm refused to let Lando adopt pacifist views, that sometimes violence was necessary, fight for the right thing. In post-Empire Strikes Back comic books, Lucasfilm refused to let them touch Why Don't They Rescue Han stories, because they were making Return of the Jedi. Marvel Star Wars issues 51 and 52 were going to have the Death Star Mark II be the main threat, but Lucasfilm shot them down and told them to write different super weapons. Yeah, as early as the 70s and 80s, they were keeping continuity in check. Continuity is something they really cared about, wasn't it? But good luck finding this level of nuance from the dumbass, misguided journalists spouting the same misconceptions over and over. My buddy IronInquistor has disputed an article by One Force Wave, where he basically talks trash about the expanded universe and whatnot. So what your challenge is now, is to always remember the canon hierarchy, no matter what. And if you're going to keep your stance intact, then keep this in mind. The Force Wave article previously mentioned was mostly about how George Lucas saw the expanded universe, which leads me to... I see a lot of people who try to use George Lucas to say the expanded universe was never canon. First of all, have no such standards with the sequel trilogy, and I've already disputed the George Lucas sold the rights to Disney argument, which, to sum it up, if Disney did not want to abide by George Lucas canon, then they should have decanonized George Lucas canon. And that includes the 6 mainline Star Wars movies, but they didn't, because they needed that stuff to sell tickets for the sequel trilogy. The reason I say that is because what George Lucas has said about his work, and the meaning of it, are also irrefutably valid. And on top of Disney invalidating his work externally, they've also done it internally. I've discussed in my video explaining how the Force works that the interpretation argument is utter rubbish. So yeah, hold the sequel trilogy to the same standard and stop making excuses. Anyhow, this video is about George Lucas and the expanded universe. EU haters are very, very selective on what they talk about. And what I mean by that is that George Lucas has a lot of statements on the expanded universe, but they cherry pick the ones that make the expanded universe out to be never canon. But if you actually looked at every quote ever, the answer is not very black and white. George Lucas doesn't have an automatic yes or no answer. It's middle of the ground and very nuanced. I've seen the Star-Lord quote a million times, so stop shoving it in my face. It's an extremely cherry-picked quote and not representative of the full picture. What I mean is that if you look at George Lucas's remarks about the expanded universe, you don't get a simple answer, but further research is required to understand. Splinter of the Mind's Eye, in the very book's introduction, George wrote this in the 1997 re-release of the book. In my opinion, this should be the main quote instead of the crappy Star-Lord quote, because the way George Lucas wrote the intro to the re-release is talking about the legacy of the book, and I think it's way more insightful into how he sees the expanded universe than just Star-Lord. Like, obviously nobody's denying that the Star-Lord quote exists, but he said a lot of other things that don't line up with the baseline, Star-Lord proves that the EU was never canon narrative. If you look at all of the quotes for the full picture, the answer is not as simple as a yes or no, but there are nuances to everything, aren't there? If you go and watch IronInquistor's video, which includes a lot of conflicting statements, I think it's clear that George Lucas doesn't automatically say no. One thing so many people fucking sleep on is that everything in the expanded universe, or at least the main plot points, had to go through George, and George himself was an active collaborator in the expanded universe. If you watch the behind the scenes featurettes on The Force Unleashed, for example, you'll immediately see that George and the game makers played off of each other during its development, expressing ideas to one another, and George Lucas gave a lot of input on how characters should be written and whatnot, such as the Emperor and Vader's relationship. You see, George Lucas doesn't see the expanded universe as his Star Wars, but as ours. Around the time TCW started airing, George Lucas stated how his story is limited to Anakin and Luke Skywalker, and everything that surrounds them, and that, what do you know, the expanded universe already told the story of what happened after, but in his canon, nothing much happened. But that doesn't make the post-Return of the Jedi stories non-canon, if that makes sense. Like, George says that if you want post-Return of the Jedi stories, then go read the Thrawn trilogy or something. And just to clear something up, when it comes to George Lucas's sequel trilogy treatments, he was mostly going through with it if someone else was making the sequel trilogy directly. Case in point, Disney. But as I explained, Disney threw most of his ideas out the window, and the ones they kept were extremely cherry-picked and devoid from the original context. I'm still annoyed that people think Luke being on an island, isolated, would have been the exact same as The Last Jedi, because a lot more happened in that film than just Luke being on an island. And given the sentiment we have from George is that he hated the film, I think it's safe to say George would have done it differently. I mean, he talks about how Disney didn't listen to him in the Charlie Rose interview, but I'm getting off track. The challenge for EU haters is to take every single quote from George, and with the complete picture, explain how the expanded universe is definitely not canon in your opinion. When it comes to my previous points, I've pointed out how everyone cherry picks to death, and when confronted with additional information and context, they ignore it because they need to defend at any cost, and that includes their integrity. I've spoken about cherry-picked and out-of-context EU stories and plot points, and also quotes that people use selectively from George Lucas and ignore everything else, like how he views, say, the sequel trilogy. This is incredibly annoying. Well, here's an idea. Why don't you write an essay about the wider expanded universe rather than just picking out some stories out of context? Mount Sorrow, as mentioned before, is cherry-picked, because no journalist I've seen ever discusses what's in the other Ewok comic issues. Wouldn't that be extremely interesting to hear what's in the same series as Mount Sorrow? Because to me, I think Mount Sorrow, on top of being out of context, is extremely one-off and doesn't appear in the rest of the damn expanded universe, and virtually has zero impact on it. One thing that me and my co-writers, yes I have co-writers, notice about EU haters is that a lot of them absolutely despise the Yu Zhong Vong for being cut off from the Force, and then they never talk about the Yislamari from the Thrawn trilogy, or hell, the Rakatan tribes and Knights of the Old Republic. It wouldn't surprise if they never actually caught on to the idea that Force sensitivity could be lost. I'm aware that the Yuzong Vong are extremely immune given they cannot be sensed, but the Yislamari did the same damn thing in Heir to the Empire. I remember from how Luke's perspective, his temporary loss of the Force was like having all his senses cut off at once. What about the Jedi Exile then? Knights of the Old Republic 2 explains that the Jedi Exile was a walking wound to the Force. And how many of you haters would have any idea what a wound in the Force is? Probably none of you, otherwise you wouldn't be complaining. But beyond that, there's countless other examples of stuff you hate on that is all over the EU, but you only mention it in a specific story. But on top of that, a lot of the haters don't explain why they hate a specific part and nothing else. Sorry to cut this point short, but basically the challenge I'm giving you is to stop cherry picking. Look at the wider expanded universe and see whether or not your hate is justified, which it isn't. Now let's move on. Something that really brings my piss to a boil is how EU haters bring up a specific story that supposedly contradicts the films, mostly the prequels, and say how the EU has no continuity. But the thing is, you should be looking at the wider expanded universe. As an example, when an Imperial character, Gillen Paleon, references fighting clones in the Clone Wars, even though he would have canonically been on the Republic side, there was a story that shows him fighting a batch of Separatist clones. Not only is the plot hole non-existent with additional context, but also Separatist clones make for an interesting story during the Clone Wars, don't you think? You'd wish Dave Filoni would have done that at some point, instead of fucking filler episodes. In fact, a lot of the confusion anyone could have about the Thrawn stories from the 90s are patched in later books. For example, the Outbound Flight novel, which ties Jorah Sabayoth and Thrawn into the prequel trilogy, and it's actually quite remarkable how they connect the dots. Expanded Universe authors in the later years really came up with creative explanations for the stuff that didn't immediately make sense. Another example is Boba Fett. Previous material suggested that he was a former stormtrooper, and that Boba Fett wasn't even his real name. It might have been Jaster Mareel instead. But when Attack of the Clones explored Boba Fett's backstory, what did the EU writers do? Did they panic and overwrite the continuity without addressing the plot hole? No. Instead, they explained the retcon in a clever way. You see, Boba Fett is a clone of Jango Fett, and there would be a misconception that he was a stormtrooper, given many clones became stormtroopers in the early Empire. Thus the misconception. And in regards to the name Jaster Mareel, it's revealed in the Jango Fett comics that Jaster Mareel was Jango's adopted father, which in Mandalorian terms would make Jaster Mareel Boba's grandfather. So they both explained the plot hole and made an interesting character in Jaster Mareel in the process. That's how you do things, and it's more that you can say about Disney, but we'll talk about that later. It's important to note that the EU actually strengthened continuity a hell of a lot actually. Thrawn talks about ATPTs and the devastation of Hanukkah during the Clone Wars, and what do we get during the Clone Wars multimedia project? ATPTs and the devastation of Hanukkah during the Clone Wars. Why do haters never mention that? Is it because they never bothered to read all the stories? Yes, that is exactly why. The expanded universe did not just ignore all the issues and confusion that would arise and hope no one would notice. If you believe that, you need to read more stories. Otherwise, you are the one ignoring stuff and hoping no one will call you out. Stories were intertwined in all eras of the franchise. It's more accurate to say that the stories enhanced and backed each other up, no matter when they were published. The expanded universe was not a messy clusterfuck. Supposed contradictions come from those who aren't looking at the full picture. Now, your challenge now is to bring up some real examples of the expanded universe contradicting itself or the films. It isn't impossible, but it's going to be pretty damn hard. Good luck. To anyone trying to say that the expanded universe was dumb and still using extremely out of context sources, just look at what Disney did to their own expanded universe. Everything people trash the EU for, without research, is infinitely more applicable to Disney Canon. Mount Sorrow in Disney Canon might as well be the living mountains Yoda fought in a throwaway comic. It's almost embarrassing how much they actually copied and pasted the ideas from the expanded universe to steal for their own continuity. The Rise of Skywalker is a classic example. They stole from Dark Empire without credit, and the look on EU haters' faces when they had to suck up to reality. They actually recycle a lot of the characters from the old expanded universe. Thrawn is perhaps the biggest example, but there are other examples including, but not limited to, Jackson, Rook, Shizor, Paleon, Revan, Tenebris, Pestige, Zim, Tev, etc. They took a lot of characters from the expanded universe and repurposed them for their own agenda, and I wouldn't be surprised if most EU haters have never ever heard of most of the characters I mentioned. Remember Dirge? If you've never heard of him, then you're not a true Star Wars fan. But jokes aside, Disney copied and pasted his character for the Dr. Aphra comics. Yeah, Dr. Aphra, that annoying character that has a World War II pilot hat for some reason. Dirge appears in the comics. Now, I don't necessarily care about the context of his appearance, because the point is that he's just fucking ripped out of Legends and repurposed in Disney Canon. Seriously, I remember when EU haters said that Disney would never quote-unquote have any of the dumb stuff from the expanded universe, only for Disney to do that many times. Let's go over some more examples. Kylo Ren, the most complex Star Wars character, according to Goldman at least, is a quintuple ripoff. He's got a similar story arc to Jason Solo as Darth Caedus. Since TFA leaves off where the EU ended, he could easily qualify as Ben Skywalker, especially with a name. He's cosplaying as Revan. He's this new generation's Darth Vader, and he's named after the villain, Kylo Ren, from the 1980s droid cartoon. You didn't think I'd notice, did you, JJ? If you're really digging, he might even be a sextuple or septuple or octuple ripoff if you look even deeper, and it becomes a massive rabbit hole of JJ's unoriginality, as he just copied and pasted stuff from the EU to shape Kylo Ren. I wish more people would bring this up when talking about the sequels, that it's not just the original trilogy. Most of what the sequel fans praise as different are actually mostly recycled from the expanded universe. But given they took extremely out of context stuff from those stories, they end up being a mess, as most rip-offs do when you copy something and don't bother to have it make sense in your story's context. On top of them stealing Dark Empire, they also ripped off Rey's retcon backstory from Ken Palpatine. Who's Ken Palpatine? Great question. He's the grandson of the big bad Palpatine in Legends. Sort of. Yeah, so not only is Rey Palpatine reveal absolute dog shit, but it was stolen from a far superior character most people probably haven't heard of. They made the unoriginal Mary Sue character and somehow made her even more of a rip-off by retconning her backstory and at the same time copying another character's story. I'd be surprised if any sequel fan ever brings this up. That might be a challenge in of itself for sequel fans. But anyhow, you get the damn point. Disney on countless occasions, across different authors, just take what they want from Legends and either recanonize it, with the shills praising them for making something canon again, or they just name it under something else. And the same shills will express ignorance and think Disney came up with it to begin with. Believe me, after so much time refuting everything Disney shills say, they don't just stop defending a corporate entity. So the challenge for Expanded Universe haters specifically is to look at absolutely everything that was in Disney Canon and see how much of it was derivative off of Legends, and then tell me how much Star Wars is crap if over half of the stuff they like is in Disney Canon is just a damn ripoff. Do that and we'll talk about other things. But hey, I believe in you to fail at this challenge. You're probably wondering why I called this Mickey Mouse's whorehouse. Well, on top of the fact that it's funny as fuck, it's extremely accurate to what I'm about to say. Something that was in an actual Star Wars book by Disney is Queen's Peril, which deals with a menstruating Padme setting off blood sensors in the royal palace of Theed. Ooh, what about the fart wedding that was in an actual Star Wars Disney story? Yeah, I'm not making either of those two up. And I don't give two shits whether or not the fart wedding was in a kid-oriented story or not. You compare it to Mount Sorrow, and it's so much more mature in comparison. The stuff that tries to be serious in Disney Canon just fucking fall flat. We know by now that the infamous Aftermath trilogy, made by one Chuck Wendick, one of the dumbest lines he wrote was this. So fucking immature, isn't it? That's dumb as hell. And I'm not done yet. Oh no, I'm not going to stop there, As Shia LaBeouf would say, let's keep going. In the Darth Vader comics, which from what I've read is incredibly stupid from the first 6 issues alone, has this character that is literally Admiral Akbar attached to General Grievous's body. Yeah, that's right. The comic writer was so uninspired that he actually thought that made for something anyone could take seriously. Let's point out some more dumb stuff, like Operation Cinder. Given they were too lazy to come up with a nuanced explanation for how the Galactic Civil War ended, they basically had the Empire stoop to the IQ level of a toddler and fucking give the rebels the victory on the silver plate. I've ripped into my Battlefront 2 EA campaign critique, so go watch that for more information. But Operation Cinder regardless is dumb as hell. I was immediately taken out of The Mandalorian when they referenced that. Like, Dave Filoni actually thought that was a good thing to reference. Ooh, let's cherry pick some more dumb stuff. How about the fact that the Inquisitors fly their lightsabers like a helicopter? Which makes no sense. I thought lightsaber blades were weightless, but if the Darksaber taught me anything, it's that Disney doesn't understand lightsabers. At all. If you're begging me to stop trashing your precious Disney Expanded Universe, too bad, because I'm going to keep going. Let's talk about how much Disney Canon contradicts itself. The sequels obviously contradict everything in the original 6 movies, so that's a start, but beyond that, the Ahsoka novel was completely discarded when the Clone Wars Season 7 came out. Dave Filoni just couldn't keep continuity intact, could he? And have Captain Rex have his inhibitor chip already fucking removed. What about Kanan the Last Padawan? A story that wasn't half bad, discarded when Filoni wanted the Sand Batch to be in the limelight when it comes to Caleb Doom surviving Order 66. They made his survival pathetically weak in the Sand Batch, so it was a notable loss in quality. What about when Yoda's lightsaber was destroyed and Luke just pulls it out in the Book of Boba Fett Episode 6, The Mandalorian Season 2.5 Episode 2, and Ahsoka Season 0 Episode 2? How did Luke get a lightsaber that was already destroyed? That makes no sense. As you can probably expect, Disney has not only added dumb shit in their canon, but their canon contradicts itself. Unlike the original Hierarchy, Disney had no such thing. It's why I fully expect the High Republic novels to be discarded in a few years. I feel minorly sorry for anyone dumb enough to think the High Republic novels mean shit. Also, it's led to video games becoming stale because the gameplay and mechanics are taken so fucking literally. The reason they didn't have a pink Darth Vader, for example, was because it would break canon, as if there was a canonical fight to the death between Rey and Darth Maul, and Darth Maul, after losing, just respawned and slashed at Rey again, while Darth Vader joined in to help Maul. Also, if that's the case, then did soldiers on the battlefront canonically pay thousands of dollars in microtransactions to get skins and star cards? I don't imagine Imperial Stormtroopers being that paid a higher wage. So it's almost like Stormtroopers spent their own pocket money on star cards that magically boost their abilities. Did they also pre-order the ability to fight on the battlefront early or something? Disney has basically taken their canon far too literally and not literally enough at the same time. Talk about convoluted. It explains why Fallen Order was very cookie cutter, but it's so goddamn dumb regardless. So here's your challenge. Try to justify everything I put forth, because this encompasses like at least 70% of Disney canon. If anything, it's Disney canon that is 70 to 90% garbage. Let's move on. Here's something I wish Expanded Universe haters would address. Pretty much no one said the Expanded Universe wasn't canon while it was canon. In the same way people say George Lucas sold the rights, so his opinion doesn't matter anymore, never cared about what he thought while he owned Star Wars, it's all a retrospective narrative, made to fulfill an agenda, that being that Disney is so much better than the pathetic Expanded Universe. This is the reason this video is being made, because someone has to set the record straight. All the classic EU hater arguments discussed so far, like 90% of the content was garbage, the EU had no continuity and it was a mess, Skippy the droid was a canon story, etc., only came after the Disney purchase. Those who never bothered to experience the Expanded Universe and became attached to Disney's corporate anti-art only started to perpetuate this narrative to defend it. although it did become a thing once Dave Filoni happened, although it wasn't severe until Disney because they were still continuing the expanded universe. I've seen Disney higher-ups, after decanonizing the expanded universe, try to make people believe the expanded universe was a convoluted mess. In a very ironic quote from Dave Filoni in the foreword to the Disney Canon novel A New Dawn, he said, and I quote,
"The old concept of what is canon and what isn't is gone. And from this point forward, our stories and characters all exist in the same universe. The key creatives who work on the films, television, comic books, video games, and novels are all connected creatively for the first time in the history of the Star Wars universe."
Of course it would be Dave Filoni that said that, because he had little to no experience with the expanded universe. TCW and expanded universe we'll talk about later, but the point I'm making is that absolutely no one, unless they weren't fans to begin with, argued that the expanded universe was never canon. They've only started to say so after 2008, where all of their talking points kind of make sense somewhat. I mean, they still failed to consider nuances, but at least they could perpetuate a false narrative out of context. It seems like the guy who built up this idea was Dave Filoni himself, and how appropriate it would be him. He was given an unnatural amount of power over continuity, and he did what he pleased. He pretended that his shit was part of the expanded universe when it really wasn't. There's this archived article from early 2008 that asked 5 questions relating to the upcoming show at the time, and I saw a blatant bit of false advertising, where it says that the Clone Wars 2008 would not overwrite or contradict the 2003 micro-series. Yeah, right. Go to hell. Anyone saying that the expanded universe was never canon prior to 2008 would probably be exceptionally hard to find. And that's because practically no one said it was non-canon while it was canon, because they'd obviously be wrong. It becomes easier and more practical to do so after 2008 and after the Disney buyout, because it suited a narrative that didn't exist prior to that point. So here's your challenge. Explain why absolutely no one regarded it as non-canon while it was still canon. Maybe try to find non-cherry-picked quotes that actually definitively establish it was never canon. Good luck! There's a big misconception I wanted to say for last. That being that the Clone Wars 2008 was the only true extension of George Lucas's work. It wasn't. People use this excuse to explain why TCW wasn't decanonized along with the rest of the expanded universe. And the truth is, George Lucas was just as involved in many other things, such as the Ewok movies and the holiday special. But they weren't made canon, were they? The Clone Wars was always Dave Filoni's thing. Also, there's the fact that Dave Filoni snuck behind George's back to keep Ahsoka alive. Yeah, that's right. He lied to George to keep Ahsoka alive. What a loyal apprentice, am I right? I'm just joking. Filoni is no apprentice to George. That's just some narrative Filoni popped up himself, so everyone would look up to him as an encyclopedia concerning Star Wars. It's extremely sleazy, because nowadays people don't ask George any of the necessary questions. Instead, they go up to Dave Filoni and ask him questions instead. And what do you know? Dave Filoni is one of the perpetuators of the myth that the expanded universe was never canon. The same guy who cherry-picks shit and gets all the praise in the world for it. People were so happy when Thrawn was made canon again, as if Dave Filoni deserves to be regarded as a hero for bringing this extremely popular, cherry-picked character from the expanded universe and very little else. Guys, that was only done to get people to watch Rebels. Since he appears later in the show, it encourages everyone to start from the beginning, just so they can catch up to the Thrawn stuff. Very deceptive, very slimy. Seriously, it seems that everyone except for me and a handful of others don't seem to realize that Dave Filoni is an overrated cowboy who takes what he wants and receives all the praise in the world for it, regardless of whether or not he created it. The Clone Wars was always Filoni's thing. It was also never held up in G-Canon. Instead, a new slot created for it below G-Canon, known as Television Canon. Proof enough that it was never G-canon, Star Wars Underworld, if it had been made, would have been T-canon as well. It's more accurate to say with all that information that the expanded universe was overwritten not because it was never canon, but because Dave Filoni was given an unnatural amount of power to override it and obliterate continuity. Since a lot of casual fans ask me how Dave Filoni retcons the expanded universe, I could use many examples, such as Ahsoka being a problem because Anakin first and foremost was promoted to Jedi Knight 2 years and 6 months after the Clone Wars instead of immediately after the Battle of Geonosis. On top of that, Ahsoka was a character that was never even alluded to. Anakin did not have an apprentice. That's just something Filoni made up on the spot. There's also the fact that practically none of the battles in the original timeline made it through unscathed. Dave Filoni's show basically just made shit up. And given Anakin wasn't even supposed to be a Jedi Knight yet, all of the battles in TCW with him as a Jedi Knight, which is practically all of them, are a retcon in of itself. It's a continuity nightmare. If you want me to discuss more retcons, I have a playlist of the Clone Wars 2008. I'm still working on the Season 3 review though. What I'm here to talk about is how Dave Filoni is not a lore master, and never was. If he went up against a real lore master, that lore master, if he took his job seriously, would have ripped up Filoni's pitch for the show in a heartbeat and tell him to change everything as Filoni bursts into tears because he forgot to make copies. Given Wikipedia exists, he could have just looked shit up, or even then, ask Leland Chi or some other chap whether or not his pitch was lore accurate. Filoni is the guy who acts like he's been granted the rank of master and hides behind George as a meat shield but has little to no integrity himself. Let me repeat the point. TCW was never G-canon and was always Filoni's thing. The expanded universe was canon but was overridden because Dave Filoni was given too much power over it. There's the context. Continuity before then was absolutely sound. So there's literally no excuse. I've explained how TCW's position in the original continuity, so the challenge for expanded universe haters, and by extension, Filoni groupies, is to explain how the expanded universe was never canon, despite all the context I just gave you. Sourcing Filoni isn't going to do much, given he's the same guy who just takes what he wants when he feels like it, and relies on Disney to bail him out, and it happens every single time, to the point where I think he's getting more and more arrogant. So that's 10 challenges for expanded universe haters, and the end of the 10 challenges trilogy. I hope you guys enjoyed this trilogy calling out the 3 main misguided categories of Star Wars fans. That being those who support the corporatized sequel trilogy, those who hate on the prequel trilogy by making stupid criticisms, and those who have never picked up a single expanded universe book in their life, but still express utmost confidence in bashing them regardless. You will find these challenges impossible to beat, because I know what I'm talking about. I remember this one guy in 10 challenges for sequel fans bluffed about beating my challenges, and then when I asked him to explain how, he no joke just told me, "Oh, I beat these challenges, I'm just not writing the answers." Seriously. My strategy to winning an argument is by talking someone to death, and this guy puts a smile on my face, as I can tell this guy is bluffing out of his ass. So if you fit all 3 categories, consider this 30 challenges for you instead of 10. With that being said, that pretty much wraps up this video. Here are my patrons on screen. And please consider subscribing so I can reach my goal of 1,000 subscribers. I'm JJ Plagiarisms. And until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?
We found you hiding, we found you lying, choking on the dirt and sand. Your former glories and all your stories, dragged and washed with